Good afternoon. My name is Eric Bergloff. I'm the Chief Economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. I'm absolutely delighted to moderate this fantastic panel on the green transition. The timing couldn't be better and more important. Events of this last year, like flash floods and extreme temperatures, have demonstrated the scale and urgency of the climate challenge. In a week's time, COP26 will start in Glasgow. The outcome will be critical to whether we can turn around what are increasingly worrying trends, taking us further away from the 2-degree or 1.5-degree target set out in Paris. The AIIB is absolutely committed to being part of and helping shape this important journey for our member countries. We have committed to align ourselves with the Paris Agreement by mid-2023, and our corporate strategy mandates us to have 50% of our project financing climate mitigation and adaptation by 2025. Many of our members have set out to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060. We want to help them reach this objective in the most efficient way possible. And we want to make sure that to do everything we can, that no countries are left behind. Yet there are many issues to resolve for the green transition to be successful. Is technology available in time? Will there be the right policies in place? And perhaps most important of all, do we have the necessary finance arrangements and instruments to ensure that the right technologies are applied in time? Do we have the right coordination mechanisms to ensure that we all work towards the same objectives? Well, these are some of the questions we hope to answer in this panel. We have a fantastic set of presenters and panelists, and we very much look forward to their interventions. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, and we are keen, if possible, to bring in the audience as well. I will do my best to keep us on track. In particular, I will be brief in my introductions of the individual speakers to give them and us as much time as possible to discuss the green transition. So before we go to our two opening keynote speakers, we wanted to see what our audience thinks about the green transition and the prospects of reaching net zero carbon. We wanted to run a simple poll, and it's going to come up here, I hope, yes. And so when do you think most emerging economies and developing economies in Asia will become carbon neutral? So if you think it's by 2050, by 2060, by 2070, or after 2070. So these are four options. And so we see here where there is a lot of skepticism, it seems, that we will keep the 2060 target. We'll let it run for a few more minutes, or a few seconds rather. Okay, there is still, at least it's encouraging that more than a third thinks that we reach them by 2060. So let us, I think we'll have an idea. We'll come back to this later on. So our first keynote speaker is Dr. Francesco Camera, the Director General of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. It was set up to support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future. We're absolutely delighted that Dr. Camera has been able to join us for this event. So without further ado, I give you the virtual floor. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. So, dear Minister Rania Al-Mashat, dear Minister Nasseh Yassin, fellow panelists, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to join you today at the AIIB's annual meeting seminar to discuss such a timely and urgent topic, one that sits at the heart the heart of IRENA's mandate. I would like to express my appreciation to the government of the UAE for hosting this seminar, and thus presenting IRENA the opportunity to host a session at our headquarters today. The significance of the choices we make in the coming years are clear. We must make the right one. There is no longer room for error. Since I have the privilege of setting the scene of this discussion, I will use the funding of our World Energy Transition Outlook and focus on practical examples. This report was conceived as a compass to guide member states to carbon neutrality. It is rooted in the sense of urgency to act on climate change, but resolute in charting a path toward a resilient and more equitable world. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you can see on this slide, IRENA considers electrification and energy efficiency to be the main decarbonization driver by 2050, enabled by renewables, green hydrogen, and sustainable biomass. And these technologies can shape the avenues to lead us out of the crisis toward a decarbonized energy system. Since IRENA inception, our members have asked that we be the global voice of renewables. 10 years later, we can see that our voice has been heard loud and clear. IRENA's vision of the energy future is today mainstream, with renewables routinely at the center of climate and development strategies. Now is the time to take it to the next level. The World Energy Transition Outlook set the stage for step change, but several prerequisites frame its conclusions. We have captured them in a guiding framework of the Veto theory of change that you can see in the next slide. Thank you. As I often say, energy transition is not about a change of fuel, but it is calling for a real systemic change based on a holistic approach. The outlook priorities a path that is most likely to rapidly reduce emissions in the coming decade and set the trajectory for the development of the most promising technologies. It provides a timeline and clarity on steps to be taken to manage the transition from fossil fuels. And it shows that success will only be possible if the process is inclusive, from the engagement of citizens at the local level to ensuring that all countries of the world have an opportunity to keep pace with and benefit from the transition. Let me give you a few numbers from a global perspective before focusing on what the energy transition means for emerging and developing countries. This brings us to the next slide. Investment and policy choices are key to success. As you can see here, we estimate that 131 trillion of US dollar will be needed to realize the pathway we depict in the outlook. This is 33 trillion more than what current strategy and plans in place envisage. And we also consider that there are 24 trillion that has to move from subsidies to the new technologies. Next slide, please. But this is not an additional cost, as you can see. IRENA's analysis shows that when the reduced externalities from lower air pollution and avoided climate change are combined, the overall benefits of the energy transition is valued at between 2 to 2.5.
Francesco, I'm afraid you are frozen. Can you hear us, Francesco? Okay, so yeah, I guess we have to do so. So I'm sorry about this. Our second keynote speaker is Dr. Ma Jun, the former chief economist of the People's Bank of China, and he now runs his own institute supporting the green transition in China and beyond. He's also co-chair of the recently resurrected G20 working group on sustainable finance, and which was brought back by the Italian G20 presidency. Unfortunately, Dr. Ma has to leave us shortly after his presentation, but he's kindly agreed to answer some questions immediately after. So please, Dr. Ma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Great, great. Thank you again. It's my great honor and pleasure to be participating in AIIB annual meetings. I think I've done this quite a few times, and this is a timely event which is focusing on green transition that's really dear to my heart. Let me just touch upon a couple of issues related to green transition. One is what's going on in China, given that President Xi Jinping announced the carbon neutrality goal back about a year ago. And secondly, the role of green finance within China. And finally, I touch upon the international cooperation in the green and sustainable finance space, especially the G20 work, which I co-chair with US Treasury colleagues. Now, starting with China, as I said, in September last year, the goal of carbon neutrality was announced by President Xi Jinping. And since then, we have seen lots of government guidelines and roadmaps and documents specifying the specific actions for different sectors and regions and so on. For example, recently, the Central Party Committee and State Council issued a document outlining the carbon peaking and carbon neutrality. It's what I call a high-level framework for the roadmap. And following that, it was a State Council document outlining the roadmap for the coming 10 years, which is the carbon peaking period. And at the regional level, there are lots of provinces which have produced or in the process of producing their roadmap. I have the honor to lead a team to help a Chongqing municipality to produce the carbon neutrality roadmap together with a green finance roadmap. And at the corporate level, many large corporates, for example, Bao Steel, announced that they're going to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, which is 10 years ahead of the national target. And the Sinopec, that's one of the largest oil and petrochemical company, also announced that they're going to they're going to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So a lot of real actions that's going on within the corporate sector. In the financial industry, we have been working on the green finance practices in the past few years, but over the past year, the efforts were elevated to the focused topics. For example, how do we revise the taxonomy so that the projects of green finance supporting are consistent with the carbon neutrality goal? And how do we improve the disclosure requirements so that the corporates and financial institutions will be able to report carbon intensity of the activities? And how do we design incentive structure so that the low carbon activities will get a stronger incentive? So all these are what's going on in China in the financial space. Let me give you a few more specific actions which were taken or about to be taken. On the taxonomy side, in April this year, the central bank revised the green bond taxonomy and removed clean coal technology from the taxonomy. The clean coal technologies were in the taxonomy back a few years ago, largely because China was focusing on air pollution, fighting air pollution. And these technologies were able to remove SO2 and NOx, but were not able to reduce carbon emission. At that time, it was considered as green, and now, against the carbon neutrality goal, it's no longer considered as green. So that's how the taxonomies are being revised. And I think other taxonomies for green lending, green projects will also be revised accordingly. On the disclosure side, the previous disclosure requirements were largely on environmental related objective. For example, disclosing corporate activities impact on air quality, water quality, and biodiversity and so on. And now we're adding the carbon related information to corporate disclosure as well as financial institutions disclosure. The central bank governor said that we will introduce a mandatory requirement for financial institutions to disclose carbon-related information. And 20-something major banks are being asked to begin the preparation for carbon intensity-related information. And I think going forward, carbon intensity of assets of banks and other financial institutions will be used to judge their performance. The green performance will be linked to incentives. As for incentives, I think the latest trend is for the central bank to provide low-cost financing to low-carbon activities. I expect the central bank will announce a formal mechanism, which is called decarbonization facility, very soon, which will bring low-cost funding through the commercial banks to the green projects. And this facility will be a much larger scale operation than the previous green relending facility. At the product level, over the past few years, the financial system have produced, I think, the largest green lending market in the world. We have now 14 trillion RMB worth of green lending in China, and we also now have the second largest green bond market in the world. But products still need to be innovated and scaled up. For example, we need a lot of many varieties of green products, including green ABS, green REITs, green ETF, and we need to open up a channel for cross-border green capital flows. So all these are things the financial industry is working on. One more task which has been raised, but I think will require additional efforts is introducing transition finance arrangements. So far, the green financial system, whether in China or in other places, are not able to accommodate the transition activities in an efficient way, partly because the taxonomies do not contain enough transition activities. Disclosure requirements are not dynamic enough to reflect the nature of transition activities over the longer term, and the incentives are not directly associated with transition itself. So all these things need to be revised so that in the future, the majority of the economy, which are relatively high carbon, will get financed, not to financing them to maintain the current carbon intensity, but to finance them to transform their operation into low carbon and zero carbon activities. So let me switch quickly to the international side of the story. As you probably know that China, when we were as the presidency of G20 in 2016, we launched the G20 Green Finance Study Group, which I had the honor to co-chair. And that group initially were focusing on forming a global consensus or political consensus on scaling up green finance. That was successfully done in 2016. And in the following few years, the study group delivered quite a few important recommendations, including the need to conduct a climate and environmental risk analysis, the need to promote liquid green assets for the capital markets, and the need to introduce digital technologies to system finance. And many of these are picked up by the financial industries and become mainstreamed. This year, the G20 re-established the study group under the Italian presidency, and it's also upgraded to a working group, which is different compared with a study group in two ways. One is that a working group is a longer-lasting mechanism, and secondly, a working group in the better position to make recommendations rather than just options. So within this year, it's about to finish. I think within 3 days, our study group work, our working group work will finish for this calendar year. We are producing two major deliverables. One is a G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which I think will be endorsed by the G20 leaders in a few days and published in the beginning of next month. And the second thing is a synthesis report, which looks at a few key issues on alignment approach, which include taxonomies and ESG rating methodologies. And we looked at the reporting standards for sustainability and also transition finance. And all of these issues are included in the roadmap as a guide for the G20 work in the coming few years. Now, within these topics, let me just touch upon 2 or 3 that I think are hugely important and require global coordination. One is we need to improve the comparability, interoperability, and consistency of taxonomies in the green finance space. Currently, I heard that there are already 200 taxonomies in the world. Some are developed by countries and authorities, some developed by industry associations, some developed by companies and financial firms. This is equivalent to like a few hundred languages being spoken in one community, which certainly creates problems such as market segmentation, additional costs, and the risk of greenwashing. And that's why in the G20 roadmap, we are recommending that in the future, the development taxonomy need to follow a set of principles, and these common principles will help converge these taxonomies. And secondly, we're recommending the voluntary use of reference or common taxonomy. And one of such common taxonomy that's coming out is being produced by IPSF, International Platform for Sustainable Finance, under which a working group co-chaired by China and the EU are producing a common ground taxonomy based on the Chinese and European taxonomy. And we're encouraging voluntary usage of such taxonomy, either for issuing green assets or for developing new taxonomies and using that as a reference. And for regions with many smaller economies or illiquid capital markets, we're recommending that such regions consider developing a unified regional taxonomy. I think the good model is Europe. They have a unified taxonomy that's called EU taxonomy. Just imagine that if EU have 27 taxonomies, it's going to be totally chaos. And for places like Africa and maybe in ASEAN countries, I think it's worthwhile to consider developing a regional taxonomy for use by all the countries and member jurisdictions, so that to avoid segmentation and market confusion. Now, just to touch upon the reporting standards, there are lots of reporting framework and standards and principles already related to sustainability. And again, the proliferation of such reporting standards may create new problems and transaction costs. Just imagine one fund manager managing a portfolio of companies coming from 20 countries. He needs to understand 20 different reporting standards and translate the indicators into something that he can compare, which is hugely costly. So our view under the G20 working group is that we need to promote the establishment of an internationally consistent set of standards for reporting. And in that regard, we are supporting ISSB, International Sustainability Standard Board, to undertake these tasks. I'm expecting ISSB to be up and running by end of this year and produce the first set of reporting standards initially focused on climate by next year. And finally, just one point on capacity building, especially for emerging markets. I think that's the key for AIIB as you're serving emerging markets in this region. The emerging market economies are very, very keen to develop green finance, but I think they need help in many aspects, including taxonomy development, including disclosure requirements, product development, as well as new forms or new products that are suitable for these economies with lower funding cost. Let me stop here, Eric, and back to you. If you want to ask 1 or 2 questions, I'll be very happy to talk to them.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was very clear and very informative. So maybe I can just a question on China. So you spoke about these new high-level framework that's being adopted, and you spoke about some very specific interventions that are now happening in China. How do you see generally the sort of balance between planning, market mechanism, and the financial governance dimension? How does that play out in China, and are you in the right place, so to say?
Well, I think carbon neutrality is a program for a few decades, and what we are seeing now is a set of very, very high-level, framework. and we need to work on lots of details and a lot of coordination issues. For example, how much administrative measures you want to use vis-a-vis market forces, such as the carbon markets. And within the carbon market, how do you coordinate the function of allocating quota among the major emitters vis-a-vis the participation of financial industries, so that they can generate liquidity and also bring risk management tools. And also there's coordination between carbon peaking, which is a 10-year time frame, vis-a-vis the next 30 years carbon neutrality. So all these issues are very complex, and we're facing a lot of issues and problems and challenges, and we need to work on producing such coordination mechanism and learning from international best practices.
And so, following up, that we have seen these power shortages in individual provinces in China. To what extent do you see this as a consequence of this process, or is this explained by other factors, and what could be done about it?
I think the current power shortage is largely a macro issue or a legacy issue. It has a little bit to do with the carbon neutrality, but not hugely. Let me give you 3 reasons that's leading to the current problem, which I believe are main reasons. Number one, it's a surge in export from China. Despite some slowdown, the export growth in China is still above 20% year on year, which really reflects the ability of Chinese manufacturing sector to supply these goods in the COVID environment, while many other countries are unable to produce. So this is tentative. And the second thing is, in the last few years, the regulators were very harsh implementing environmental rules and also safety rules on coal mining companies. And many of these companies were scared. If they have one injury, I think the boss will be penalized. That's why they were probably too cautious in maintaining the operation, and many of these were shut down. And recently, a corrective measure were taken to boost the production very quickly. And also, there was a problem of asymmetric pricing between coal price and the power tariffs. The coal price went up a few times, while power tariffs were controlled, and making many coal-fired power generator unprofitable, and therefore they were reluctant to produce power even if they have coal. Again, this problem is being addressed. The NDRC just introduced new controls on coal price and lowering the prices, and at the same time allowing the power tariff to be moved upwards. That's going to solve partly the problem. Carbon neutrality has a little bit to do with that, because there was a double control mechanism to control each province and localities' total energy intensity, but that has been in place for many years. It's not a new phenomenon. I think it explains only a small part of the power shortage for now.
Yeah. Maybe before you go, a word on the international situation. So you gave these important elements: the taxonomy, the reporting standards. So a concern that some countries, particularly in the emerging world, has had, that they, and developing countries, that these standards do not really help them, because they are very demanding and maybe also in some elements even biased against emerging and developing countries. How do you see dealing with this? That how can we ensure that this kind of finance also goes to these countries, and we don't leave any of them behind?
I think for cross-border capital flows, it's necessary to maintain a internationally consistent set of standards. Otherwise, international investors, if they do not recognize your assets are green, they will not participate. But for any country, if they want to develop a green taxonomy, it's their own jurisdiction. They will make the judgment. But internationally, we are making the recommendation that some basic principles need to be respected, so that eventually the convergence of different countries' standards can happen. And that's why I think some sort of a common reference taxonomies should be developed, and they could be used as a reference or as a sort of the baseline building block for different jurisdictions' own taxonomies.
Well, thank you. I know that you have to catch a plane or a train, I don't know, but to go somewhere. So thank you so much for joining us for this event, and good luck both with the Chinese efforts and of course the international efforts. You play a very important role. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
So Dr. Camera, we unfortunately lost you in the middle of the presentation. Is there a chance that we can hear the end of this, or do we need to go on? Okay, fine. So sorry about this. These things happen. I was going to see if we can do these polls. We had two polls that we wanted to do very quickly to see, can we get them up? So the first one, what do you think is the most important driver to enable green energy transition in emerging economies and developing economies in Asia? So this is between technology, financing, and policies. And so people seem to think that policies are the most important thing. If we don't have the right policies, we won't get the financing, we won't get the technology. Okay, I think it has stabilized. Can we get the second question as well? So here, do you think emerging economies and developing economies in Asia have the policies and technologies necessary to become carbon neutral? So this is a follow-up to the previous question. Are these things in place, particularly when it comes to policies and technologies? So there is quite a bit of skepticism that this is in place. So we will hear more from our panel about these issues. So let me start with this panel discussion. So we've heard two presentations from Dr. Camera and Ma Jun. The questions we have are very much a follow-up to this. So I first want to go to Her Excellency Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister of International Cooperation in Egypt. So you have been a big proponent internationally, and you have shown in practice, how to bring together country stakeholders to achieve sustainable development goals. So how do you see the coordination playing out in the green transition? And can you give some examples from the Egyptian experience? Please, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with the AIIB annual meetings on a very timely and important topic. And just as countries were moving out of the pandemic, now we are also going into the acceleration of the green transition. Let's say that, or let me explain how Egypt worked on this early on and how the international community was mobilized around it. So in 2015, Egypt issued its integrated energy strategy, which had very clear KPIs with respect to a renewable energy mix by 2035 and by 2042. This was announced. Several structural reforms took place, particularly on the feed-in tariff, which allowed for private sector engagement in renewable energy going forward. And that was basically the beginning of also mobilizing international financing to the private sector and through PPPs to one of the most important and influential solar parks in Africa, which has been banned. So this is just one example. There were also other examples related to projects for adaptation and mitigation, some of them related to water waste management plans, some of them related to the green transportation, if you will. So your poll showed that people still believe in policy. And I think that's where everything starts. When governments have clear policies related to their green targets, to this very important agenda, which has now been accelerated through the green recovery post-pandemic. I believe that that is the best way to mobilize the international community in line with the national strategies. What we do is we make sure that there is complementarity across our development partners when it comes to the participation in the different projects. So Egypt is very unique in the sense that certain projects will have more than one development partner. AIIB, for example, was involved in the BIMBAN project that I mentioned, along with IFC, along with EBRD. So this is a very unique example of clear policy, complementarity between the development partners, and also a transparency when it comes to the implementation. So this is these are just a few examples. And where we are today, given the importance, of course, of water for Egypt and so forth, we do have water waste management plans which have taken place, but also water desalination is very high on the agenda. And also today, green hydrogen is something that the country is putting together to be able to export to Europe. And then finally, because everything adds up, we also have, or we have been able to move from a deficit in electricity to a surplus. And today, through regional agreements, there is transmission lines with Saudi Arabia, with Jordan, with Iraq, with Libya. So all of this also adds not just to the green targets within the country, but also helping other countries within that sphere.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in His Excellency Nasser Yassin from Lebanon. He's just become Minister of Environment, and we are very interested to follow what's happening in Lebanon. It's facing a major financial and energy crisis today. How do you see, in recovering from this crisis, the role of the green transition?
Good morning from my end. First, it's a great pleasure to join the annual meeting for the AIIB. Lebanon is part of the Asian community, and we look forward to more collaboration. Dr. Eric is an old friend, so that's also to meet again in different capacities, Eric. So thank you so much for the invitation. As mentioned, Lebanon is going through a multifaceted crisis, economic crisis, unprecedented, as the World Bank has put it, but also banking crisis and crisis related to the fall of the local currency, a monetary crisis, and all of these have impacted every sector and every facet in Lebanon. Exacerbated by COVID-19 and the lockdown, and then came in August 2020, this major blast in the main capital, in the main city, the capital's port, in August 2020. It's unprecedented by all means for a small nation to get all these crises together in a short period of time. 13 months of caretaker government has meant a lot of policies were put on hold, a lot of ways to manage the crisis and to prevent further fall in all sectors has meant all of these were not put in place. So this is unfortunately the situation, and we took over, or we were appointed 6 weeks ago. So we are at a position now that we cannot go back to the previous. We need to think of any recovery to be placed and centered around green recovery. That's something I've been working on in addition to the sectoral elements of recovery, is to position green recovery within the plans for the government when it comes to the negotiation with IMF into the sectorial plans and programs. We need to think, if we want to build back better, that's the only way. And how to translate this in real terms. Focusing on renewable energy with the Ministry of Energy, and how to move out from an endemic crisis in energy that has siphoned a lot of resources in the last decade or so, how to actually think of green energy as the way forward, or renewable energy as the way forward. The energy mix is to be placed in the thinking of the government with renewables at the heart of this. Not easy, it's not straightforward, but it's doable if we think of it this way. Similarly for transport, and we're working on that. Similarly for all other sectors, is to include such thinking in the recovery path and in the recovery programs. So, I think the roadmap for Lebanon's macroeconomic stability, with all of these challenges, really major challenges we're facing, need to be green, need to be inclusive, and need to actually think of and confirm that no one can be left behind through these policies. It's not a luxury when we think of green recovery. It's not a first world policy or donor-oriented strategy. I think it has to be at the heart of the coming recovery.
Thank you very much. That's very encouraging. We haven't spoken much about the role of private and institutional capital in this, but of course, Dr. Ma Jun was mentioning the need for rules and international standards. We are absolutely delighted to have Jean-Jacques Barbery from Amundi. Amundi, we have worked with Amundi on a framework to try to identify climate champions among issuers of green bonds and so on. So I wanted to ask you, what are the obstacles you see when investing in the green finance space in emerging and developing countries?
Thank you very much, Eric, and I hope you can hear me well. I'm awfully sorry for the little technical adjustment that I had, and sorry for the video, very bad background that is behind, but unfortunately I had to place myself somewhere where I could probably log. So first, it's a real pleasure and honor to participate to your annual meetings. And I think to answer to your question, well, I think first, there is a very good news at the moment, which is that as most of the investors are trying to generate the maximum of impact in relation to their climate investments, they all know that the maximum of impact that can be generated will be in emerging countries. And therefore, I think this is not an obstacle. That is something that will encourage more and more capital deployment in emerging countries to finance the green transition. If I come back to your question, I see there are three elements that at the moment slightly problematic or may delay a little bit some capital deployment by institutional investors. The first one is very short term, but unfortunately from time to time investors as well are looking at the short term, is the fact that we're still, I would say, in an inflationary context that may be a little gently problematic for a number of investors to consider capital deployment in the short term in countries where the inflation figures are very high. I hope, because this is our base scenario, that progressively we'll see these inflationary pressure diminish. But I think let's face the fact that indeed this might be a hurdle in the short term. Then afterwards, I think there's always the understanding that by definitions the returns will be higher in deploying capital in emerging countries, but the risks associated to them might be as well a little higher. And therefore, I think the risk-return profile might be an obstacle from time to time, but I think there are very good ways that we can address that challenge, notably through public-private partnerships or the use or public capital to de-risk a little bit the investors. I think a number of schemes have been put into place in the past years, and we think they're extremely efficient, and based on our experience, they work. And the final element I would mention, the third one, I think in some countries, there's still some lack of ecosystems. I would say, for instance, what is the third party you can use that is independent to ensure that the green bond is properly green? And I think so building up the associated ecosystems for the deployment of instruments to finance the green transition is, I think, of great importance as well. This is why trying to build up these type of ecosystems or references, for instance, I think what AIIB has done in defining this framework to make some green champions emerge in emerging countries is a very important tool and interesting tool, because I think beefing up these ecosystems is clearly a very important element. So I think we need to work as well on, I would say, how to help to issue the right instruments in emerging countries to address the demand of institutional investors.
All right, thank you very much. And it's encouraging that you see at least some of these issues as being temporary and hopefully going away, and that we can try to build these ecosystems that you are talking about. I wanted to go back to Dr. La Camera, because you were, unfortunately, we lost you for a while there, but you know, obviously you have been very important in promoting the access to these technologies, and maybe can you summarize how you see it today? To what extent are these technologies now available, and to what extent do we have the technologies in place to reach the net zero carbon on the timeline that we have set out?
Thank you, Eric, and sorry for all the problem, but as far as I understand, the presentation is available for all the participants, so that at least this may diminish the damage of the internet problem. Concerning the technologies, we make clear in our World Energy Transition Outlook, where we say that the energy system of the future that is building on will be based largely on renewables and complemented by green hydrogen and sustainable biomass. These are the enable of the two main drivers that are the electrification of the energy system and the energy efficiency. We know that we are going for a wider electrification of the energy system from 1/4, more or less, today, to more than 60% in 2050. And where concerning power, electrification will be the 19% of the source. And when we talk about renewables and green hydrogen, technologies are there. And this also apply for sustainable biomass. So innovation has to be happen into these big avenues that will bring us to a pathway that could be consistent with the 1.5. So concluding, trying to be brief, the technologies are there. There is no doubt. We have to find a way to provide for investment, going in that direction, and enabling the environment. Naturally, I want to make clear that it's not just a question of technologies. We have also to take into account the social change that will accompany this new energy system forming. This means that we have to put policies to ensure that who is going to lose the work, just to give an example, may have an easy access to new jobs and better jobs into new energy system. So policies and investment have to go together so that we can work for an energy transition that could be inclusive and just give benefits to everyone.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to Minister Al-Mashat. Egypt has a very special role as sort of a hub between Africa, particularly North Africa, but also the rest of Africa, the rest of the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. How do you see your role potentially in helping neighbors and helping others in bringing in these new technologies and ensuring that you get the right policies in place and so on?
Well, thank you, Eric. Let me just mention one thing that I forgot to say. We were the first country in the Middle East and Africa to issue a green bond. This was in September 2020. So despite the pandemic and everything, this was a part of the policy reform related to the green transition. As I mentioned, the regional integration is extremely important. And recently, you see, for example, with Saudi Arabia now, we have a transmission line, which is going to be a hub for the rest of the Gulf, where you have electricity. We have a surplus today. Saudi has a surplus, and this is going to be able to create more energy source for the rest of the Gulf. The same with Jordan. There is an electricity line there. With Iraq, we are building one, and with Libya. When it comes to Europe, through Greece and Cyprus, in addition to the Euro-Mediterranean gas forum that we have, there was just a mission last week where there's going to be a transmission line for gas through Greece to Europe. And here there is also very important opportunities for investments, whether from the development partners or from private sector. Going green also involves green hydrogen, which is extremely important, and everybody's talking about it. So given our, and usually the source is renewable, and given that we have that energy mix today, we will be able to actually produce that, and the goal is to export to Europe. So there is plenty going on also in terms of partnerships with private sector companies. Just recently there was something signed with a Norwegian company on green hydrogen, and that is going to be the beginning of what comes next. So absolutely, it was very important to solve our structural problem, which was a deficit. Now we have solved that through better pricing mechanisms, through a very transparent energy strategy, a mix which is more towards green and renewable. Once that happened, you're able now to go regional and go also through international lines to create more efficiency in that sense. And every meeting we attend today, there's a lot of talk on innovative financing tools, blended financing schemes, where banks like yourself and other development partners that provide to some extent the concessional part of lending, how can we scale that up with private sector investments? As was mentioned, every company today wants to have impact investment, wants to push for green. Even banks need to have green projects on their books. So there is that opportunity to bring all stakeholders together with bankable projects that have very clear goals, add to the national agenda, but also contribute to the global agenda as we are moving to COP26 and later on to COP27.
Thank you. Dr. Yassin, can I ask you, so you heard what Dr. Al-Mashat said here, and also the role of international development partners. How in Lebanon is in a very precarious situation now. Do you feel that you have the support that you need, or what could be done in addition to make this green recovery a reality?
First, before I say the official line, I want to thank Minister Mashat, because Egypt has been quite supportive for Lebanon in the past few months. And I've met 2 weeks ago the Minister of Environment, and we've really have full partnership on collaborating on different issues and learning from the recovery and from the programs that the Minister of Environment did. So I'm going to thank her formally and as a friend. But I want to say that the crisis and the nature of the multifaceted crisis in Lebanon shouldn't push us back and shy us from being innovative and being creative and even being ambitious. And that's what we're doing in the current plan and the current program. So at the Ministry of Environment, we will mainstream green recovery and the green economy. So we're designing a Lebanon Green Investment Facility. It's been in the works for the past few weeks, and we're going to stress on this in COP26 in the next few days. And we aim through this facility to be the main instrument for channeling climate and green financing and make affordable finance instruments, concessional loans, grants, blended finances. This is key. Now it goes with the hand in hand with the current negotiation we're doing with the IMF. But that's a part and parcel of the green recovery and the way forward for us in the Ministry of Environment and the sister ministries around us, whether energy, agriculture, and other places. We want to support in this facility public and private sector, as well as provide technical assistance, for any bankable projects. I know the banking sector in Lebanon is under a lot of strain and is going through a major crisis. But we're talking to the World Bank on how to provide, guarantees for such facility. So this is in the works, and we want to announce this in the next few days and after COP in Lebanon, and get this moving.
Thank you very much. So let me try to move it back to the global level again. And Mr. Barbaris, when you look at your challenge of mobilizing institutional investors, you have been very critical in bringing together that community on innovative products and so on. What is holding you back today? We know that there is a huge amount of institutional capital that potentially could go into emerging and developing economies, or more generally into also the green transition globally. What is holding you back? What is needed from the international community to help you push this agenda forward?
Thank you very much. First, I would say that I think we're at the beginning of something that we do not completely measure, is the fact that now there is not a day without having a private financial institution announcing its carbon neutrality targets. And this will have very strong consequences because it means that more and more institutional investors are going to ask people like us, asset managers, to manage their portfolios with net zero targets, so with alignment targets. We're at the beginning of that, but this will have profound consequences, and I think it's important to mention it. I think if I come back to a little bit to what we would need, first, you wouldn't hear anyone from the private sector in such a panel not saying that he or she would like a total absolute harmonization, which I think unfortunately is not possible, but we're all dreaming from a single carbon price. We're all dreaming for single reporting standards for companies. We're all dreaming even for a single taxonomy at worldwide level. So by definition, all these three things would be totally desirable, but unfortunately, I don't think they will happen in the short term, and we have a decade to act. Therefore, at the very minimum, what we need is coherence. So not maybe unique standards, but at least coherence. And that's why I think there is a lot that the international community can do, and countries or regions together, for instance, to ensure that the different taxonomies in the world are coherent with each other. And I think there has been a lot of work, for instance, that had been done already between China and the European Union on that front. But I think the first thing we need from the international community and the respective countries is coherence. The second one is to ensure that behind the targets, and notably, I hope the higher mitigation targets we would have after COP26, you have the appropriate set of regulations that is in place. In a way, I think the private sector and the financial private sector is begging for more regulation at the moment, which is not that often. We need to have, I would say, regulatory frameworks in place to ensure that these targets are being delivered, because this is what will ensure ultimately that this is reflected in the prices associated to the respective sectors. The third thing I think that can be done, and I think ministers mentioned it, it's clearly favor all the blended type of finance that can be put into place, notably to finance the projects that may have the largest impact, but that may not be totally spontaneously bankable. And I think AIIB is showing a lot of leadership on that front. And the last thing we need, and I would echo very much one of the former speakers just said, we need also the international community and countries to put in place the set of policies that make sure that the transition is fair and just, because there will not be any transition that is not socially acceptable. And as investors, we also need to progressively embraced the fair transition agenda, because that's what will make ultimately the transition credible, and that's what credibility is needed for investors to deploy capital in the long run.
Thank you. Could I pose the same question to you, Dr. Camera? What is it, in your view, that the international community can do to make sure that this technology gets even more widely available and put in place in practice?
Eric, I will try to start to say what we are trying to do as arena to facilitate this process. One of I think that the topic that may have a priority is the lack of planning. You know, we have published our World Energy Transition Outlook, but it's global. The fact that if we go into the different regions of our membership that is global, we see that not always there is a clear planning in place. So we will work from our side to build this planning framework. We are, thanks to a compact that we presented with the European Commission to their level dialogue on energy in New York. We will go to have 5 regional outlook for Africa. We are going to publish by the first quarter of the
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry about this. We have problems staying in touch with Irina, but hopefully they will come back at some point. Maybe coming back to Dr. Al-Mashat, and we asked you initially about the sort of green transition and the coordination around that. You have been an advocate for better coordination at the country level more generally. How do you see that playing out, and could this help address some of the challenges that both Dr. Camera and Mr. Barbaris put on the table?
Well, I think that one of the key words today was harmonization, that there are too many metrics going around, even with respect to the ESG, with respect to different ways to measure. And going forward, if the world is going to be really serious about the different targets and so forth, there has to be this element of trying to create some benchmark or baseline, as was mentioned from fellow panelists. So this is something which I believe is going to be at the center of COP26 discussions, in addition to the financing, to be able to support the green transition for different countries. We know that there has been pledges before for $100 billion by 2020, but that has not materialized. And now with the acceleration, yes, there is, of course, an opportunity for emerging markets, but there is increased cost as well, particularly that emerging markets do not contribute to the emissions the way other countries do. So there is that debate. On our side, given the importance of development finance for Egypt, we work with the world and with development partners, both bilateral and multilateral. What we are trying to do with the Green Agenda is to try and also streamline their contributions, whether when it comes to studies and technical assistance or to the financing. Egypt is, most likely going to get COP27, so that's also going to put a very different and new dimension with respect to all the efforts we are doing domestically in order to push for the green recovery, our different projects, our different policies, and also advocating for what the world needs to do, hand in hand with emerging markets. So there is a huge role with the international community, try and have, a common goals, common measurement items, also how to quantify all of this. Blended finance, for example, is something which is mentioned a lot, but there is yet a framework that we can all rely on. And it really depends on which investment bank you're talking to and which structure they are putting together. So I think that there is a very urgent need to have open discussions and very candid discussions very quickly between the banking, commercial banking, investment banking, and the IFIs to be able to, as soon as possible, help emerging markets push forward with this very, very important agenda, because if they do not, then we will be at a disadvantage. So there is, and it was mentioned also earlier, the commodity prices that is taking place, the oil prices, all of this is going to lead to increased challenges on the social front across different countries. So we need to look at the green transition not in isolation, but as part of this bigger evolving picture.
Dr. Yassin, so Egypt, luckily, maybe is in a more stable state right now, and has been able to have a longer term perspective on these issues. You are in the midst of a very serious crisis. Does this country level coordination between the international partners, is that working for you? What could be done to make it more effective and helping you in the green recovery?
So the current discussions with the IMF are key. They're strategic for the government. Hopefully, we will get to the point of a framework agreement towards the end of the year, and that will put us on the road for a IMF program. I think upon having an IMF program, that would put us on the reform, put all the reform agenda on the table, particularly when it comes to fiscal reform, and will show the commitment of the government for this roadmap. Most donors have been committed to Lebanon, the international community, of course, Arab countries, particularly Egypt, and now hoping through this renewed collaboration with the AIIB to have some discussion with additional, supporters and donors. But the idea here is to get the reform agenda in place, and that's what the international community have been reminding us for many years. Grants, loans, and other finance facilities are looking for the success of such IMF program as a sign of seriousness from Lebanon's side on reform, and that's what we're doing, and that's what we're hoping to have in the coming months. At the coordination level, it's happening at the Prime Minister's team office, and we don't have a Minister of International Cooperation and energetic and active like Dr. Mashat, but we're collaborating with the Prime Minister and his team, particularly around the current negotiations with the IMF. Sectorally, we've been working, I can talk this from the Ministry of Environment perspective. We've been having renewed and new collaboration with other departments and other donors, placing the environment and the green recovery at the heart of those sectoral plans. So when it comes to energy, transport, agriculture, economic activity, and so on, we want to place, and we're aiming to place the green recovery and sustainability within those sectoral plans.
Maybe could you also spend a minute on the issue that Dr. Al-Mashat brought up at the end, and then also Mr. Babaris emphasized the sort of social dimension of this, and the notion of the just transition, and the pandemic has brought out many inequalities in societies and reinforced many issues that we sort of were aware of, but we have really seen them in bare daylight now. How do you see that dimension playing out in your reform efforts in Lebanon?
Of course, the crisis has deepened inequalities, to put it this way, and to put it mildly, actually. And by introducing such recovery plan and the reform agenda, we're very serious about inclusiveness in such efforts. Income inequalities have increased significantly in Lebanon, and with it, social inequalities, access to education, access to health, and so on. So there is at the moment efforts towards cushioning the underserved communities and the more vulnerable communities in Lebanon from any serious measures when it comes to fiscal reform and other reforms. But the idea is really to include social policies and social protection at the heart of the coming program. I don't know if I answered you towards my my side that I like most, which is the social part, but I'm happy to go further in this if you wish. But you know, I mean, any reform agenda and any coming program shouldn't leave anyone behind, and that's a serious commitment. So when it comes to bringing back educational policies, health policies, social policies into the agenda, they have to be well proved and well protected from any coming measures.
So let me maybe bring in some questions from the audience here. There's a question that we have touched on, but maybe we should spend some more time on it. It's how do you see, and all of you, the sort of trade-offs between, on the one hand, the green transition and other worthy goals, and of course here we touched on this in the context of China with the possibility that you have shortfalls in power supply and so on, and of course it relates very much to this issue of social objectives that we have talked about now. So the question, how serious do you see these conflicts, or can they be brought together in a sort of harmonious way? Maybe I'll ask Dr. Al-Mashhad first, and maybe we can let the others.
I mean, conflicting objectives is not something new, neither nationally nor internationally. But I think recognizing the magnitude and the degree by which certain things need to move is important, and it's paramount now because too many things are happening at the same time. So this is adding pressure on governments, on private sector, on citizens. And everybody's just beginning to get out of the pandemic, but yet we are faced with additional upheaval of different sorts. So the green is consistent with recovery, is consistent with skills and jobs, is consistent with ability to mobilize private investment. But if it is done in a manner where there is what's the right word to use? Not nervousness, but one of collaboration, a spirit of trying to also be mindful of the different growth trajectories of countries and so forth. So I think that more frank and open discussions, complementarity across goals, and also sequencing is something very, very important, and being mindful to the development processes in different countries. There is no one size fits all. And that we've learned that whether it comes on fiscal policy, monetary policy, structural reforms, green is going to be also, something in addition to that. But we need to have an open dialogue, and really the international community should come together on this.
Dr. Yassin, on the same question.
Yeah, the same question. So, I'm going to give you an answer that I usually give to in community discussions and field trips I've been doing in the last few weeks. And Lebanon, and this is just, an out of the cuff answer. The Lebanon has a very rich green areas in Lebanon. It's fortunate to have forests and protected areas and reserves. And I've been actually talking to a lot of the community members that when we do a protected area and we protect a natural reserve or a place that's rich in its biodiversity, it's not actually has to be seen as a top-bottom decision from the government to protect an area as such. That's actually has to be built around the local economic recovery of the communities in Lebanon. So the natural capital is at the heart of any economic development when it comes to creating jobs, building human capital, keeping people on in their land and not migrate to the cities and so on. So that's in a simple way an answer to, and that's an answer to a question we get a lot in Lebanon. I mean, how we benefit from these? What does it mean to us? And green recovery, as put skillfully by Mr. Mashat, is actually at the heart of economic development. These shouldn't be delinked from each other. And from simple examples, straightforward examples of protected areas and natural reserves and keeping biodiversity and protecting it, to actually working on renewable energy, on transport, and on other sectors. So something I'd like to, in 30 seconds, to say, the language around climate change and green transition and recovery, the language is very dry. People on the streets don't get it, straight away or straightforwardly. It's very academic, very policy oriented. And it's actually our job to simplify it, but in a way that people on the streets can see this as related to their everyday life, to their livelihood, and to their lives wherever they live. It's not a academic or a political or policy narrative and language. It's something that actually matters for everyday life.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barbaris, can I ask you, I mean, these are very tricky issues for private sector and institutional capital to get involved in, but you brought it up yourself and you emphasized the importance of this. So what can you do? And what maybe looking both at the situation in a place like Egypt, where, you have things are maybe more long-term in nature, and then you have the, very immediate, urgent issues that Lebanon is facing. What is the role of private sector? What is the role of institutional capital, if any, in this situation?
Well, thank you very much. Well, first, I would like to echo your question. I think there was a former French president who was defining the politique as basically making the arbitrage between very legitimate objectives that may be not coherent with each other. So I think within green transition, we're at the very heart of the definition of politics. I think. Well, first, what is important for us as well, first, it's to acknowledge the fact that indeed there will be some strong redistribution effects associated to the transition. So maybe ultimately, all in all, it can be win-win globally, but there are some redistributive effects that are there and that needs to be taken into account. That's one. The second thing, I think what the private sector can do is also trying, and it's not easy, trying to encompass the fair transition agenda within what the private sector is doing. So I'm going to give you two very concrete examples. The very first one, it's, for instance, when you are discussing with a company into which you are investing, when you engage it on its green transition pathway or the green transition plan, to ask the question, and how do you encompass the social dimension of it? And so really to make it, I would say, an element of the engagement, also as well, maybe as an indicator of the way we invest. That's one. The second thing is to help. Ultimately, it's not the private sector to decide between, I would say, the different policy objectives, and this is for good. But I think we can help also to make sure that the challenge is made aware of everyone. For instance, something that we tried to do with a number of other investors was to create an international coalition for the fair transition, which is an engagement coalition vis-a-vis companies. And by doing that, it's a coalition that gathers a little more than 4 trillion. We try as well to put the fair transition on the agenda. And ultimately, to answer to your question, what can we do in some of the countries where we are? I think it's to ensure that we're here for the long term. So if I take the Egyptian example, Crédit Agricole Group, that is the main shareholder of Amundi, is an important bank in Egypt, and I think it's demonstrated is a commitment to be there in the long run to finance, I would say, the long-term projects in Egypt. And so that's what we can do, is to be here for long in the countries in which we believe and where we believe that the whole agenda is encompassed in a coherent way.
Thank you very much. Before, I think we are running out of time. Before we conclude, I wanted to run the poll again and see whether we have changed people's mind or whether we are still. Maybe can you bring up the last poll, actually the first poll again, and we see what. So after listening to this conversation, do you think most emerging economies and developing economies in Asia will become carbon neutral? So I'm looking at the results from the first poll. There we had 38% for 2060. I think there's a bit more of optimism now around the possibilities of achieving these objectives. And I hope if we can have played any role in both bringing out the issues, but also giving a sense that this is something that is possible. I think we have achieved something in with this conversation. And I think what came out is, of course, that this is an extremely timely, very important and very urgent task, the green transition. And as Dr. Camera put it, there's no room for error. We have to get it right. And I think these kind of conversations that we had today are a very important element of that. We do have the technology, and it's already used in many countries around the world, but it's still not on a scale that is consistent with the ultimate objective of the green transition to reach carbon neutrality. So I think we have also had a lot of examples of the need for coordination at the international level, at the national level, and ultimately at the local level. Dr. Al-Mashad spoke about the country level coordination. Dr. Yassin spoke about dealing with the communities and dealing with their concerns and their all of this is important. And of course, we heard from Dr. Ma Jun about the need for global action and the establishing taxonomies and establishing reporting standards. All this is needed. We heard from China about the efforts there to put in place a sort of high-level framework and taking very immediate steps, establishing a trading system for emission rights and all this putting in place also new facilities to help commercial banks play a more important role in China. So all that is very encouraging. Mr. Barbaris emphasized the challenges that we see in many emerging countries, and there are some immediate ones with the inflationary pressures in many particularly large emerging economies. There are the risk premia that we are so familiar with from emerging and developing countries. There are ways of mitigating them. Certainly, the multilateral development banks have a role to play there, but also I think governments and other institutions have a role. And of course, ultimately, we need these ecosystems that are so important for getting the finance in place. We need the regulation. We need the agreed taxonomies and so on to make this happen. So I think hopefully this conversation has and it seems that the poll bears this out, that we are a bit more optimistic. But we do realize, and everyone has emphasized it, this is not only a technical process, this is something that is very much also affecting people's lives. And we need to be very conscious of the distribution impact, the impact on inequalities, and we need to find ways of ensuring that this becomes a very inclusive process, so a fair and just transition. So with this, I want to thank everybody for their contribution, and we have had some technical challenges, but I think we, in the end, had a very interesting and encouraging conversation. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in different places and different conversations in the future. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Bye-bye.